So just a note about today's sermon. This is part one of a two-part service, you may have noticed. And we're going to talk about some relatively challenging things in this part one that only get fully addressed in part two. So it may feel a little unresolved at the end. There may be a little unresolved tension. I hope you will tune in for part two. And in the meantime, I always welcome conversation about the sermon if you'd like to chat about it in the meantime. So, without any further ado, let me open with this profound observation. It really got cold fast, didn't it? Like, it's not technically winter for another month, but winter, sure seems to be signaling its arrival. Like, it is raring to go. And how beautiful was the snow yesterday? If you're watching this on Zoom from a location other than Indianapolis or even Indiana, you should know that here in Indy, we woke up to substantial snowfall yesterday morning. I opened my eyes in bed, and through the window, I could see it all coming down. And when I looked out, the ground was already blanketed, and the snowy branches of trees had shaped this beautiful winter silhouettes. It was magical. I love the first snow of winter. The cold, not so much. But the first snow is like this signal that flips a switch in my brain, stretching all the way back to childhood, that activates this sense of wonder and anticipation, which for me is also intimately tied up with the holidays as a time of abundance. So we didn't have a lot growing up. When we were littler and my parents were still young parents trying to start a family, we didn't have a lot. Maybe you know that story. We had a roof over our heads, and we had food, and we had heat, and those are things that I am deeply grateful for. But there wasn't a lot of presents and toys and parties and special feasts going on during the ordinary course of the year. Birthdays were very modest affairs. We didn't have a lot. But Thanksgiving and Christmas was always the season when we did it up, right? There were big family dinners at grandma's with the tables just kind of laden with food and desserts everywhere, lights and decorations, this kind of visual feast, music, merriment, singing, sonic abundance. There were those once-a-year cartoon specials on TV that you could only see at this time of year. If you're like a millennial or Gen Z, you have no idea what I'm talking about, but it used to be feast or famine for cartoon specials. So only at this time of year could you see the Grinch or the Charlie Brown Christmas special. My Christmas spirit was brought to you by Dolly Madison. Thank you very much. For some reason, the sound of music this time every year, so I also kind of associate Christmas with fighting Nazis, which I'm good with. My older brother got to go to midnight mass, which I was always too little for, and then waking up on Christmas morning, just toys in abundance. It was magical. Everything lit up and filled to overflowing just for this time of year. And I'm telling you about my own traditions, of course, growing up Catholic. There are many different traditions, religious and secular, that mark this time of year in this part of the world where the days grow shorter and the nights grow colder as the last harvests have been taken in. These traditions often function paradoxically as a kind of spiritual resilience practice against what is coming, right? We string up lights because it is about to get very dark very early. We bring greenery into the house because the branches outside are bare. We light fires in the home because the ground is frozen. And we celebrate abundance together, and we make this practice of generosity because we're entering a lean time, and soon we will rely on each other more than ever. So for me as a child, this time of year felt like a time of magical abundance. But in northern climates, for much of human history, winter was the opposite. It was a time of fearful scarcity. It was a time to be endured. It was a precarious time, right? Life often seemed poised on a knife edge of uncertainty. If the harvests were not sufficient or enough was not stored away, the consequences could be deadly. If resources were not carefully managed, disaster awaited. Scientist and indigenous author Robin Wall Kimmerer tells us that her Anishinaabe people called this the hungry season. And when confronted with the precariousness of life, the communitarian virtues that are reinforced by traditions like gratitude festivals and shared feasting, they make sense. They're a survival strategy. It is in the hard times that virtues like generosity, cooperation, mutual aid are so important. And it is in the hard times that we realize how much we need each other. And it is in the hard times when those complementary vices, greed, selfishness, isolation, short-sightedness, they become most dangerous. In the hungry season, the one who takes more for themselves without regard for the needs of the community becomes a threat to everyone's survival. So Kimmerer, in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, describes a legendary monster of the Anishinaabe people called the Windigo, a legendary monster of folklore. She writes about the Windigo, "You can feel it lurking behind you, a being in the shape of an outsized man, 10 feet tall with frost-white hair hanging from its shaking body, with arms like tree trunks, feet as big as snowshoes. It travels easily through the blizzard of the hungry time, stalking us. The hideous stench of its carrion breath poisons the clean scent of the snow. Yellow fangs hang from its mouth that it is raw, where it has chewed off its own lips from hunger. Most telling of all," she says, "its heart is made of ice." The Windigo of myth is a singularly rapacious creature. Its nature is hunger, and its curse is that the more it feeds, the hungrier it gets. It can never be sated. The desire for more, the desire to consume, is all it knows. The Windigo is a consumer without limits. And Kimmerer writes, "The collective fears and the deepest values of a people are seen in the visages of the monsters that they create. So born of our own fears and our own failings, the Windigo is the name for that within us which cares more for its own survival than for anything else." And you can imagine how in the context of a community, carefully shepherding its resources against the uncertain, the merciless winter, a monster like the Windigo could arise in the imagination, right? You can see it as the threat that it is. The spirit of selfishness threatens the survival of all. The spirit of taking, the boundless expansion of the desires of the self, is an existential threat to the community. So Kimmerer says the Windigo is more than just a mythic monster to frighten children. Traditional upbringing was designed to build resistance against the insidious germ of taking too much. The old teachings, she says, recognize that the Windigo nature is in each of us. And she laments that today the Windigo spirit is not only alive and well, but seems to have taken over the modern world. Multinational corporations, she notices, have spawned a new breed of Windigo that insatiably devours the earth's resources, not for need, but for greed. The footprints are all around us once you know what to look for. And lest we think it is easy to point the finger elsewhere at those multinational corporations to identify the monster in the other, Kimmerer says we're all complicit. We've allowed the market to define what we value, so that the common good seems to depend upon profligate lifestyles that impoverish the soul and the earth. She says it's the Windigo way that tricks us into believing that belongings will fill our hunger when it is belonging that we crave. And as Colleen noted in her reflection, this culture of consumption has been wrapped up thoroughly into our holiday tradition, so that Thanksgiving culminates in Black Friday, and the run-up to Christmas is an unceasing slog of Peloton ads and pointed reminders that if we really loved our partner, we would buy them a Ford F-150 pickup. Now, this is arguably not spiritually healthy, does not satisfy the true yearnings of our soul, and as aware as we are of the impact of this out-of-control consumption on our own climate, we know that the Windigo spirit is rapidly bringing us all into a new kind of hungry season. The hungry season of climate disruption. And this is a season we have not experienced before and we cannot predict. And it is not yet inevitable. It is yet possible that the worst of the coming hungry season can be avoided if the Windigo can be defeated. But to defeat the Wendigo, we have to recognize him in our midst. We have to tell the stories of the Wendigo so we can learn his nature. And those of us who are not culturally conversant in telling the stories of the Wendigo, which are hard and fearful stories, those of us who are not culturally conversant in telling those stories can begin by listening. So let's listen to a Wendigo story that we may not be used to hearing told as such. It's a tragedy of history, and more than a tragedy, but also a crime, that when Europeans came to the shores of this country, including those deep ancestors of Unitarianism, who we call the Pilgrims and the Puritans, they came to this country in the shape of the Wendigo to the native people. Right? Despite the near limitless resources of this vast continent, compared to the tiny number of colonists who arrived, who 150 years later at the founding of this country still numbered less than 3 million people, 100th of the population of this continent today. That tiny number of people took and took and took, displacing the native peoples, receiving their hospitality, receiving their wisdom, and then seizing their land, declaring war on their culture, and driving them from their ancestral homes. It's a Wendigo story. It's a ravenous and rapacious tale. And it's not a myth at all, it's hard fact. Although we have made some national myths out of it. So consider the Thanksgiving holiday. And I ask you to consider Thanksgiving not randomly or capriciously or because I personally enjoy problematizing other people's celebrations. But I ask you this because we are in a Unitarian Universalist congregation, and you may not know this, but yous have asked of us, of each other, that we consider Thanksgiving. At the UUA General Assembly in 2020, on the 400th anniversary of that fateful landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth way back in 1620, at that General Assembly, the assembled UUs, feeling the weight of that day, including delegates from this congregation, including delegates from this church, passed by overwhelming majority vote what is called an action of immediate witness, a resolution calling us to do something. And one of the things that they asked us to do is to look at more critically myths like the Thanksgiving story and listen more generously to other perspectives. Not because there's anything wrong with gratitude or giving thanks or gathering as a family or celebrating the bounty of nature. Those are all manifestly good things. But they asked us to dig deeper because it matters what stories we tell and what stories we don't tell. And it matters who gets to tell their stories and which stories get heard. So the Wendigo, it goes without saying, does not figure in the story of Thanksgiving as we tell it traditionally, far from it. Thanksgiving is celebrated as a story of shared abundance, of gratitude, and of peace. And in the story, the Native Americans receive the starving colonists with kindness. They teach them to farm and hunt and fish and help them survive that first winter. And in gratitude, the colonists have a magnificent feast to celebrate. The historical record doesn't exactly say whether the native people were invited to that feast, but they end up there anyway, one way or the other, however that happened, and the two share a peaceful meal together, friends for the moment. And something like this dinner did happen, and it's a nice story, and that's where the story ends. Fade out. So imagine an extraterrestrial visitor hearing this story for the first time. Maybe they're seeing one of the innumerable school pageants that happen at this time of year. Maybe they catch the Charlie Brown Thanksgiving special, which I watched over and over as a child, and they get to the part where Linus is describing the pilgrims and the natives together sharing, and the pilgrims say a prayer at the dinner, according to Linus, thanking God for allowing them to create a new world of freedom and justice. And one can imagine our imaginary alien visitors saying, that is so nice. So what happened after that? And that's not the part of the story that's so nice to remember. So in 1970, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts threw a banquet honoring the 350th anniversary of the arrival of the Pilgrims on this continent, 1620. Commonwealth of Massachusetts threw a banquet. And the organizers of this banquet invited a native man, Wamsutta Frank James, to give a speech at that banquet because they thought he's a member of the Wampanoag tribe. That was the tribe that provided the Pilgrims with that meal in 1621 that forms our modern mythology of Thanksgiving. They thought it would be good to have a Wampanoag person represented at the celebration of that multicultural breaking of bread. So they asked Wamsutta James to give a speech at the banquet. He agreed. Then they asked to see a copy of the speech he proposed to give. He agreed. Then they asked him to please not say those words, but maybe some other words instead. Look, these words that we've written for you right here. He refused. So they disinvited him from the banquet. You can find copies of the speech that Wamsutta James wrote on the internet. It deserves to be read in full, but here are some excerpts of what he intended to say at that banquet, but was not allowed to say. He wrote, "It is with mixed emotion that I stand here to share my thoughts. This is a time of celebration for you, celebrating an anniversary of a beginning for the white man in America, a time of looking back, of reflection. It is with a heavy heart that I look back upon what happened to my people." He says, Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag, welcomed and befriended the settlers of the Plymouth plantation. This action was perhaps our biggest mistake. We, the Wampanoag, welcomed you, the white man, with open arms, little knowing that it was the beginning of the end, that before 50 years were to pass, the Wampanoag would no longer be a free people. He continues, and so down through the years, there is record after record of Indian lands taken and in token reservations set up for him upon which to live. The Indian, having been stripped of his power, could only stand by and watch while the white man took his land and used it for his personal gain. This the Indian could not understand, for to him, land was survival, to farm, to hunt, to be enjoyed. It was not to be abused. Two distinctly different cultures met, he observes. One thought they must control life. The other believed life was to be enjoyed because nature decreed it. And he concludes, what has happened cannot be changed. But today we must work towards a more humane America, a more Indian America, where men and nature once again are important, where the Indian values of honor, truth, and brotherhood prevail. He says, we are determined, and our presence here this evening is living testimony that this is only the beginning of the American Indian, particularly the Wampanoag, to regain the position in this country that is rightfully theirs. Rightfully ours, he said. And because the Commonwealth of Massachusetts declined to receive these words at their celebratory banquet, on Thanksgiving Day in 1970, Wamsutta James and about 500 other Native Americans gathered on a hill near Plymouth Rock, and he delivered his address there. They declared Thanksgiving Day a national day of mourning, to remember and to mourn the violence done to Native peoples, to draw attention to the legacy of that history of theft and violence in the lives of Native people today, and to demand justice and the return of land. This account of the founding of the National Day of Mourning comes from his granddaughter, Keisha James, who is still intimately involved. And 53 years later, the National Day of Mourning is still observed every year on Thanksgiving Day. Native people use the day to fast, to mourn, and to speak out. According to the organizers, participants in the National Day of Mourning honor indigenous ancestors and Native resilience. It is a day of remembrance and spiritual connection, as well as a protest against the racism and oppression that indigenous people continue to experience worldwide. Non-Native people are welcome. They are invited to join as allies, but only to listen and not to speak. And the event is live streamed every year, so all can view it. And so for 53 years, these two stories have been publicly proclaimed here in America: the Thanksgiving myth, the National Day of Mourning. The Harvest Gratitude Festival and the Windigo story of limitless taking? And how do we hold the tension of these two things? Because we need all the good things that Thanksgiving represents. We need values like family and community and generosity and gratitude, right? We need laughter and love and connection and time together. And we need to recognize the Wendigo in our midst. And in the specific case of this specific Wendigo story from our nation's history, we need to recognize that there is great harm that has been done and great harm that is still being done, and that restitution has to be made. So how do we hold that tension? And what are we called to do? Well, Native perspectives on Thanksgiving are complex and multifaceted, as you can imagine. Thanksgiving and gratitude are deep values in Native cultures. So next week in part 2 of this sermon, we're going to listen to the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving Address, which is a declaration of gratitude to all of creation. And we're going to talk about how gratitude is key, in fact, to defeating the Wendigo. Stephen Peters, a Wampanoag tribe spokesperson, has this to say about the contemporary celebration of Thanksgiving. This was in 2020, the same year as that General Assembly resolution calling on all of us to think more critically about this myth. Stephen Peters, the Wampanoag tribe spokesperson, said, "I think celebrating Thanksgiving is great. My ancestors had 4 harvest festivals throughout the year, gathering with family, enjoying our company, sharing our blessings, and giving thanks for all that we have is a good thing. So I say have more Thanksgiving events throughout our year." He says, "I also ask you to take a moment in that day to remember what happened to my people and to the history as it was recorded, and not the narrative that we have been given in the history books." Mr. Peters also wants the National Day of Mourning to be observed and for the two events to be kept separate and distinct. So we will close our service today then, respectfully, with his request, which he makes of all of us. He said, "I hope the issues that are raised at the National Day of Mourning impact our conversations at the Thanksgiving table." And maybe for now, that is enough. And may we receive that invitation with gratitude, and may we be grateful for our faith tradition that calls us to have hard conversations in the spirit of love. Amen.